Hello, and welcome to our presentation of the Deloitte Financial Services Regulatory Outlook for 2019. I'm David Strachan, and I run Deloitte's EMEA Centre for Regulatory Strategy. I'm delighted to be joined today not only by you, our audience, but also by Andrew Bully, my fellow partner in the Centre, and a panel of experts from both the industry and Deloitte. Andrew will introduce our panel in a few minutes. Now, we published our 2019 Regulatory Outlook yesterday, and it's available to view and download on our website. Now, some of you will know this is the third year in which we've had a webcast to introduce the Regulatory Outlook. We've changed the format slightly this year to make it, as some football commentators might say, a game of two halves. The first half will focus on the cross-sector themes in this year's Outlook, and the second will look at what we call supervisory constants. While these constants have fewer new developments, we expect the topics to be very high on supervisors and hence on your agendas next year. For each half, I'll give a short introduction and then Andrew will lead a discussion by the panel. So let's start with a whistle-stop tour of the 6 cross-sector themes I mentioned. Now, the first is what we call the shift from regulation to supervision. It's fair to say that we see 2019 as being very different in some respects to this year. 2018 has seen a number of new regulations come into force: MiFID II, PRIPS, IDD and GDPR. All of those have involved huge and exhausting implementation programs. In 2019, however, there's nothing of a similar regulatory scale to be implemented. Instead, we expect regulators and supervisors to assess how well firms have implemented the new requirements. Specifically, are they delivering the right regulatory outlooks? And even though firms may have implemented the letter of the regulations, are they really complying with the intended spirit? So that in turn puts further onus on firms to ensure that regulations have been suitably embedded. In doing so, they should look to optimize their approaches where at all possible. Our second theme is preparing for Brexit. It was a theme in last year's Outlook, and of course it is the year in which Britain will most probably end up leaving the EU. Due to the challenging political nature of the current situation, a lack of certainty remains over the final terms of the UK's withdrawal from the EU and transition being finally agreed and ratified. The uncertainty may well go right up until the wire. Given this, firms have no choice but to continue to prepare for a no deal unless they can rely on the UK's temporary permissions regime. At present, the EU shows very little signs of reciprocating outside the area of CCP recognition. However, we have recently seen moves by some individual member states to give themselves emergency powers to respond to a no deal scenario. And that reinforces our view that if push comes to shove, authorities will choose emergency fixes over consumer detriment or financial instability. And while I mentioned just a few seconds ago that there won't be anything like MiFID II or GDPR in 2019, the operational and implementation challenges associated with Brexit, pending a Brexit no deal scenario, are clearly very significant indeed. A new theme for this year's Outlook is IBOR reform, IBOR being the interbank offered rates, of which LIBOR is the most well known. 2019 will see pressure to transition away from LIBOR growing, especially for firms here in the UK, with greater focus and scrutiny of whether firms are reducing their exposure to LIBOR. More immediately, firms will also need to prepare for a transition away from both EONIA and possibly Euribor as well. No one should underestimate the impact of IBOR transition. It looks set to be one of the biggest and most complex transformation programs many firms will have to undertake. Now, we see climate change and sustainability growing in importance in 2019. Much as it pains me to say, it's fair to say that we underestimated just how important this topic would be in our 2018 Outlook. Global, EU and national regulators are all in the process of defining their expectations for climate change risk management. Amidst rising investor pressure and industry action, central banks and regulators will increasingly focus on the financial risks that arise from climate change and expect firms to work towards identifying those risks and managing them. I mean, in simplified terms, we see this as regulators seeking to extend climate change beyond the world of CSR and ECG teams into the domain of the Chief Risk Officer. That, I think, is the essence here. Next topic is building resilience to operational disruptions. It's high in the agenda for regulators worldwide. I think firms' increasing exposure to both IT and cyber risks, as well as growing awareness of the harm that operational disruption can cause, will see regulators scale up what is already a pretty high level of activity and scrutiny of operational resilience. Firms will need to show they understand their risk exposures and have the capability to deal with any potential disruptions, including, and I emphasize this, those caused by third parties, which supply them with critical services. The trend that has emerged since the crisis for geographical and activity-based ring fencing may, I think, soon extend to operational ring fencing as well, certainly in some countries. Finally, our last cross-sector theme for 2019 is value for money. So we see conduct regulators putting a growing emphasis on the economic consequences that poor value products and services have on consumers. Now, of course, this is familiar territory, very familiar territory for those subject to FCA regulation, but we see signs of increasing interest on the part of supervisors outside the UK. And regulators will focus particularly on firms' fees and charges across customer groups and on the transparency and comparability of products, expecting firms to apply clear and fair charging structures. So that completes my first set of scene setting. Now I'm going to hand over to Andrew to introduce our guests and to open the discussion on these cross-sector themes.